my wedding planning friends, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for clicking on my video. I'm Emily Summer. I'm a wedding planner based in Montana, and I make weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice. So today's video, we're going to talk about something that has become increasingly popular and something that I think is important to talk about all the details that go into it, and that is having a wedding inside a national park. We've seen a pretty large increase in what we like to call adventure style elopements, or having some kind of wedding ceremony or wedding take place inside of a national park. This is great for adventurous couples that love to go on hikes, or maybe they just want something that's a little bit non-traditional style for their wedding. Not to mention the pretty epic photos that you can get from having a wedding inside of a national park. However, if this is something you are considering, there are a lot of details to take into account and make sure that you are fully prepared if this is something that you are envisioning for your own wedding. First thing to understand is that having a wedding of any kind inside of a national park, it is ideal if you are approaching this as more of an elopement style. So what I mean by that is it's pretty much just you, the couple, an officiant, a photographer, and maybe a witness or two if that is a requirement. That way, it's going to be a lot easier for you to find locations that will work for you. It's a lot less people to coordinate, and just spatially a lot easier to have your wedding ceremony the less people that you have in attendance if you are doing a national park. Depending on the location, you can potentially have a small number of guests with you in attendance. Again, it will depend on the specific location that you plan to have your ceremony, and make sure that it will allow for the accommodations of however many guests you want to have in attendance in that physical location. So the number one thing to understand when planning a wedding or wanting to plan a wedding inside a national park is the permits that are required. Pretty much any national park you go to, anywhere that you have in mind, you are likely going to need a permit to have a wedding inside of the park. So the permit allows you to have a ceremony. Even if it's just an elopement style, you will need to have this permit, but especially if you plan to have any extra guests. And typically on the permit, depending on the national park, it will give you a couple different options for the date that you choose, as well as the specific location inside of the park. So usually there are some set locations inside of the park that are pretty common for this type of event, whether it is an elopement or a more formal ceremony. So you will likely put what your top choices are on the permit for your specific date and location. You can basically think of this process like selecting your wedding venue. So you would be searching your venue and putting down a deposit and signing a contract with an actual wedding venue, much like applying for this permit is going to secure your venue inside of the park. Every park is different, so you can find the requirements needed for whatever you have in mind and the permit applying process at the national park website, which I linked in the description below. So you can use that site to navigate to whatever park you are considering for your wedding and be able to find out all the information that you need for both the permit applying process and what regulations or restrictions might be in place for that particular park. Since this style of wedding and elopement, adventure elopement style has become more popular, it is crucial to make sure that you are submitting your permit application with enough time in lead up to your wedding date. So before, it would only be about 30 to 60 days. However, now I would recommend submitting your permit and your application fee at least 6 months in advance of the wedding date that you have in mind. The cost for this permit application fee varies across parks, but it's typically between like $100 and $200. So just kind of keep that in mind when you are budgeting for your event, that you will need to pay for the permit application as well. Now, just because you submit a permit for the location that you want, or a permit in general for the national park, that does not guarantee you the spot. So there is a chance that location has already been selected, or if you have indicated you plan to have certain guests or specific things happening at your wedding for that particular location, you might get denied based on whatever regulations they might have in that spot. So understand that this is an application process, and just because you submit for the permit, it does not guarantee that you're going to get your number one spot or your number one date. The next thing you want to make sure that you are understanding is the physical location itself. Have a very good understanding of what that location is going to look like, feel like. You want to understand what capacity it can hold. So if it's just the two of you and a photographer, it's a lot easier to find locations. However, if you are somebody that is wanting to have some guests in attendance at your national park wedding, you need to make sure that you are finding a location that can hold the capacity of what you want. And make sure that when you are thinking capacity and understanding what their limit is, you are including whatever vendors are going to be present as well. So it isn't just the guest count. You need to make sure that you are taking into account your officiant, you are taking into account your photographer, videographer, any other vendors that might be on site in the ceremony space are included in this capacity number. Understanding things like, can you bring in outside items such as chairs or florals or other decor? Some parks have a lot more restrictions and regulations with these types of things than others. So if you are planning on having guests there, maybe elderly guests that you don't want to have standing the whole time, can you even bring in chairs from an outside source and walk them into the location if that's something that you need? You want to make sure you have a good understanding of what the terrain is going to be like so that you can properly inform whoever will be in attendance on, footwear, what to expect. Is there a long hike to get into where your actual ceremony is going to take place? These types of things that not only you can be fully prepared, but anyone that is going to be in attendance can be fully informed and prepared. Also understand if the place you have in mind is a very popular or very scenic spot. If this is the case, it's likely also going to be one of the most popular spots. So even if you get your permit approved and you have a permit to hold a wedding in this location, it's still a public park. So that doesn't guarantee you exclusivity to this spot. It guarantees you exclusivity for that particular time in hosting a wedding ceremony. So you don't have to be competing with another ceremony that could potentially be happening, but keep in mind that there will still likely be people around and there isn't really a whole lot you can do about that. And especially if people are hiking in the area and they see a wedding is happening, they're even less likely to leave and more likely to kind of stick around and be looky-loos. So keep that in mind. If you're wanting a more private ceremony where there aren't going to be strangers potentially around, you'll likely want to do some research and find a spot that's going to be a little bit less popular. Now, when it comes to planning a full-on national park wedding, typically only the ceremony is included in this. If you are wanting to have a reception, this is 99.9% of the time going to be taking place outside of the national park, as there likely is not a spot that will accommodate a reception style. So typically a good route to go is to find a hotel that's either right outside the park or rent a house like an Airbnb and be able to host your reception there. This also works well if you are just planning on having a small intimate ceremony like elopement style with just the two of you and a couple witnesses. That way, if you are wanting to include other people, they can just be a part of the reception and you don't have to worry about too much logistics and dealing with a lot of individuals inside of the park. So they can just be ready to go at your reception space for whenever your private ceremony is done and you leave the national park. Other things to be aware of and some tips to have a successful national park wedding. Be aware of traffic. If you are planning on having your wedding ceremony or elopement on a weekend, these are obviously going to be the highest traffic days for public traffic getting not only into the park but through the park. So there might be a really long line to just get entrance into the park, but there also might be a lot of traffic navigating through the park itself and getting to your actual ceremony location. So make sure that you are keeping this into account. Maybe go and visit the spot on the same day that you are planning to have your wedding ceremony so that you can get an understanding of how busy it's going to be, how much time it's going to take to get from the entrance of the park to the actual location where you plan to get married, if there are other timing factors that are going to be contingent on your wedding ceremony timing. Also understand any ticketing systems the park has. So if you have a permit approved, a lot of times this will grant you access into the park, but that is not always the case. So make sure that you are understanding if you need to have your permit for your wedding ceremony in addition to having an actual ticket to get or pass to get into the national park itself. This goes for any guest that will be with you. If you have additional cars, so if everybody that is at your wedding ceremony is in one vehicle, then you should be ready to go. But if you do have other guests that are going to be in attendance that are in a different vehicle, make sure that they have whatever information, copies of your permit, whatever is required so that they can enter the park the same way that you do. It's also important to understand the park hours. So this is especially important if you are somebody that is wanting to do like a sunrise or sunset ceremony, understanding the park hours, what time the front gates are going to open, and what time you actually have access into the park, and what time you have to be to vacate the park. This should come as a no-brainer, but obviously weather could potentially play a huge role in your ceremony inside of a national park, as you have literally no control over the weather and likely absolutely no backup plan. So that is one of the kind of trickier aspects of having a wedding in a national park, is you can't really pivot too well inside of the park once you have a weather threat. So whether that is high winds, high rain, overcast, smoke, whatever that might be, understanding that there might require a decent amount of flexibility when it comes to the actual wedding day and if weather is going to impact your day. That being said, the number one thing that is, in my opinion, the most important when planning or considering a national park wedding is flexibility is key. If you are somebody that is not really that flexible as far as what you envision for your wedding day, you have a very specific idea in mind for how you want this to look, how you want this to go, how you want your pictures to turn out, this might not be the best route for you. If you have a very specific idea and you want these national park photos, consider just doing a photo shoot in the park. That could be, weeks before your wedding, that could be weeks after your wedding, that could be the day before or the day after. Having a more adventure style wedding photo shoot might be a better route for you. That way you can still get all those images you really want without having to worry about too much about the weather. If the weather isn't going to be great on the day that you had initially planned, you can pivot timing a little bit better, and you won't have the overall time constraints if you were trying to get back to a wedding reception or worried about timing getting into the park and through the traffic. Maintaining a pretty high level of flexibility is going to be key in a successful national park wedding. Weather could potentially be a huge factor in the necessity of being flexible, and this could even be things like maybe it's a really overcast day and the clouds are really low, so you have to go up higher into the park so that you can get above the clouds for a better location. Or if it's really smoky on one side of the park, you might need to move to another side so that you can have views of the lake or the mountains or whatever it is that you are trying to achieve. Having flexibility, overall flexibility on the day for your national park wedding is going to be key in having success. Now, when it comes to vendors to hire for a national park wedding, there's really not a whole lot that are required. Your biggest and most important vendor, in my opinion, for this style of wedding is going to be your photographer. So you want to make sure that you are choosing a photographer that is very familiar with this style of wedding inside of this national park. They will kind of serve as almost like a wedding planner for you too, not necessarily in the planning leading up to it, but on the day of, you can lean on them for guidance and for suggestions, as they will likely have been in this position many times before. They can make suggestions on good locations, places that maybe aren't as popular or busy with tourists, places that are easily accessible, what terrain is like for guests that are going to be hiking in, and that sort of thing. Your photographer is going to be really key for not only having these epic photos, but also the planning process and kind of guiding you through setting up your wedding in the national park. This also goes for videographers. If you want to have a videographer, they kind of go hand in hand. A florist is a vendor that can kind of go either way. If you are somebody that is wanting to have a bridal bouquet, then you will likely have a florist involved. However, they most likely will not be on site. This is something that you can kind of do a la carte and just pick up your bouquet on your way to the park, and a boutonniere if you plan on having that, or any additional florals in the space if that is something that is allowed in the park. Outside of that, there aren't really any other vendors that are going to be included. You likely don't want to hire a professional DJ to come into the park. I recommend just DIYing this yourself, and the smaller the wedding, you really won't really need a whole lot of sound, like microphone speaker requirements, but you will likely want to bring some type of portable speaker in if you have like a wireless, cordless speaker that you can bring in and just Bluetooth to a phone for any music needs that you will have during your ceremony, like walking down the aisle, walking back out the aisle, whatever music needs you might need for your ceremony, I recommend just doing this yourself and having some sort of portable system with you. If you do plan on having a wedding reception separately afterwards, it's a great idea to have some kind of wedding planner, whether that's just day of or more so. Having somebody that can be in charge of the reception and be there in that physical space while you're taking care of all of your ceremony stuff is going to be super helpful, so that you don't have to worry about everything happening there with all the vendors there, the setup, greeting guests when they get there, making sure that the logistics of getting from ceremony to reception is taken care of. Having some kind of professional that can be in that space while you are getting married in the national park is a very, very good idea. Having your wedding inside of a national park can be a really unique way to express yourselves as couples and be able to have a wedding ceremony that is non-traditional and unique to you. If you are considering having a national park wedding, hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to get weekly videos on wedding planning tips and advice, and we'll see you next week.